Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is Crime and Punishment. I read the English translation, and I also listened to the audiobook of the original Russian version. I am not fluent in Russian, but I did enjoy the narration, and to me, the Russian classics just sound much better in their original language. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of the Crime and Punishment with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself, if you are interested. Now, let's get back to the review. Crime and Punishment is a novel written by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The book was written after his return from the 10-year exile in Siberia, and it is the first of Dostoevsky's great novels and my favorite, well after the Notes from the Underground. Dostoevsky was a literary giant, not only in Russia, but worldwide. He left an extensive and remarkable body of work and had influenced not only literature, but also philosophy and psychology. Without any doubt, Dostoevsky can be considered one of the greatest writers of all time. What is Crime and Punishment about? It is about the murder of an old pawn shop owner and her sister by a young man named Rodion Raskolnikov. The book is a detailed psychological analysis of motives and consequences or crime and punishment. The motives are a desire to liberate oneself from poverty and to acquire means for the future improvement, and the consequences are paranoia, confusion, guilt, and disgust. It is about balance between the physical and psychological, where psychological desire leads to physical action, which leads to psychological consequences, which further bring physical punishment. The man who has a consciousness suffers whilst acknowledging his sin. That is his punishment. Now, a bit of the plot. As brief as it is possible with such a complex book. First, I think it is important to introduce the main characters central to the story. As with most of the 19th century great Russian novels, there is a large confusing list of people, and one needs to distinguish between the main and the secondary characters. The character around whom the story revolves is Rodion Raskolnikov, a young man and a former law student who kills the old woman and her sister. Then there is Sonia, a young girl forced by poverty into prostitution. She is the strongest outside influence on Raskolnikov and his actions, and is the moral voice of the book. Razumkin, a good and loyal friend who refuses to believe in any possibility of Raskolnikov's guilt. He is also a voice of reason in the story. Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister, and one of the reasons he decides to commit the crime. Luzin, a lawyer who proposes to marry Dunya. He represents the immorality. Svidrigailov, Dunya's former employer and pursuer. He represents weak immorality in need of redemption. I find his character fascinating, second only to Profili Petrovich. And last but not the least, Profili Petrovich, police investigator. I enjoyed his use of psychology to get the confession, and for me he represents Dostoevsky himself. There are quite a few more characters, and it feels as if some of them were irrelevant to the story and could have been omitted, but perhaps the story would not have the same impact without them. The book is divided into 6 parts, plus epilogue. The story takes place in St. Petersburg in the mid-19th century, where Rodion Raskolnikov, an ex-law student, hatches a plan to kill a pawnbroker, an old woman who lives with her sister Lizaveta. Before committing the crime, Raskolnikov meets a drunk in a tavern. who introduces him to his wife and children, and one of them is Sonia. Back in his room, Raskolnikov receives a letter from his mother, where she writes about affairs of his sister Dunya. Dunya was a governess in the house of Svidrigalyov, who showed a romantic interest in her and tried to materialize his desires. The affair was discovered by Mrs. Svidrigalyov, who fired Dunya. Later, Dunya met Luzin, a lower-rank government official looking for a wife, who proposes to her and she accepts it. Raskolnikov's mother ends the letter informing him that soon he will have a chance to meet Luzin, who is coming to St. Petersburg. Walking through the market, Raskolnikov overhears Lizaveta saying that the next day she will not be in the apartment. He considers this higher intervention and decides to go through with his plan. The next day he takes an axe and hides it under his coat, goes to the pawnbroker's apartment and kills her. But he is surprised by Lizaveta and kills her also. The remainder of the novel focuses on crime's psychological effect on Raskolnikov and his behavior. He gets apprehensive and hides all the items he stole from the pawnbroker's flat. His fear is amplified when he is called to the police station, where he faints as he hears police discussing the murder. But his fear subsides when he finds out he has been called for an unrelated matter. Raskolnikov's mother and sister arrive in St. Petersburg and visit him in his flat and are terrified by his appearance. Later, Raskolnikov meets with Porfiry Petrovich, police detective in charge of the murder investigation, who through psychological tricks gets Raskolnikov to admit he visited the pawnbroker on the day of the murder. Further, Luzin arranges a meeting with Raskolnikov, his mother and sister, to clear the obstacles for the wedding, but instead the engagement is broken off. Raskolnikov also spends time with Sonia, reading biblical stories, and after it he goes to Petrovich's office, begging him to be charged with the crime or set free. Petrovich believes that Raskolnikov is guilty, but has no proof, so he uses more psychology to get incriminating facts out of him. Raskolnikov meets with Sonia again and confesses the crime to her. The confession is overheard by Svidrigalyov, who wants to use it to blackmail Dunya into marrying him, but his plan is spoiled. Next, Raskolnikov is visited by Porfiry Petrovich, who admits that he knows Raskolnikov is the killer and gives him a few days to think it over, but insists that Raskolnikov confesses in order to receive a lighter sentence. In the final part, Raskolnikov faces a decision, Sonia or liberty, and he chooses both, and in the epilogue we find out what becomes of him. And that's the basic plot. Did I like Crime and Punishment? I did. It is one of my favorite Russian classics. There are so many great books and writers in this category that it would be difficult to pick one. But this is my favorite Dostoevsky book, together with Notes from the Underground, as I mentioned before. Rodion Raskolnikov is the foundation of the story, and the Crime and Punishment are the results of who he is and the actions he takes and doesn't take. He's a young man, so his decisions are driven by ambition and naiveness. He's a bit of a paradox, handsome but badly dressed, intelligent but inexperienced, apparently a rather common bloke, but goes further than an average person would. Where Raskolnikov excels is in thinking he is special. Dostoevsky writes, "Existence alone had never been enough for him. He had always wanted more. Perhaps it was only from the force of his desires that he had regarded himself as a man to whom more was permitted than to others. He feels he is better, thus above the law. It is this youthful arrogance that leads him to commit the crime of killing the pawnbroker. His motivation is pretty common: money. But the justification is that the woman is not a contributor, but a parasite who feeds off the most vulnerable members of the society. So he tries to convince us, and more so himself, that he is some type of society's avenger or a martyr. Break what must be broken once for all, that's all, and take the suffering on oneself. Raskolnikov dehumanizes the old woman, so he can carry on the killing. In his own words, he describes her as stupid, ailing, greedy, and good for nothing. But his real motives are a lot more selfish and egoistical. The money to better his existence and the unnecessary killing of Lizaveta for his own protection proves it. Now, about the punishment. Psychological before physical. If he has a consciousness, he will suffer for his mistake. That will be punishment as well as the prison. Long before Raskolnikov's actual sentence and punishment, there was the haunting voice of his consciousness and the noose of guilt getting tighter and tighter around his neck. And the only salvation he could foresee was confession and acceptance of his penances. Raskolnikov was overwhelmed by feelings of fear and guilt, and he suffered inner terror and psychological anguish until there was only one cure: admission of the crime and pain of the physical punishment. Another relevant thing in the book are the dreams and their symbolism, which were important in Dostoevsky's work. He writes, "In a morbid condition, dreams are often distinguished by their remarkably graphic, vivid, and extremely lifelike quality. The resulting picture is sometimes monstrous, but the setting and the whole process of the presentation sometimes happen to be so probable and with details so subtle, unexpected, yet artistically consistent with the whole fullness of the picture, that even the dreamer himself would be unable to invent them in reality, thought he were as much an artist as Pushkin or Turgenev." Such dreams, morbid dreams, are always long remembered and produce a strong impression on the disturbed and already excited organism of the person. Raskolnikov had a terrible dream. There is the dream from Raskolnikov's childhood, when a horse is cruelly beaten to death, and it serves as the reason for his contempt for the society and the feelings of guilt for being part of it. To him, a peasant's right to kill what he considers useless, a weak horse, represents his own right to kill what he considers harmful, the old pawnbroker. Raskolnikov has another dream at the end of the book about the spread of nihilistic ideas through Europe and Russia, and social changes they create, which is Dostoevsky's personal opinion of where we are heading. Crime and Punishment shows strong nihilistic influences and its negative impact on the world, the consequences of our actions and what it is like to deal with them. Raskolnikov's decisions might have been based on loss or lack of faith, and it might have been connected to Dostoevsky's own spiritual state when writing the novel. The years preceding the writing of Crime and Punishment were not easy for the author. His wife and brother died 2 years before the publishing of the book, and the magazine he co-founded failed. He also became the only parent to his stepson and the sole supporter of his brother's family. So those events gave Dostoevsky a dark view of the world and the cruelty of emotional life with its unjust and maybe even unnecessary suffering. To sum it up, Crime and Punishment is a twist on a timeless story of the inner battle among good and evil. It is the struggle between science and spirituality, thinking and emotion, and choosing survival over doing what is right, and the idea that the humanitarian end justifies vile means. Raskolnikov is a symbol of the radical movements whose aims might seem noble, but their achievements are marked by violence and cruelty, since they are ego-driven and self-serving. He is the product of the 19th century utilitarian and rational philosophies, which were inspired by the 18th century Enlightenment and caused many tragic events, such as the Russian Revolution. On the individual level, the book is about choices we make and the justifications we create for them, and also about growing and maturing. It follows Raskolnikov's transformation from a proud young man to a humble adult, beaten but also hardened by his experience. If you would like to see a visual interpretation of the book, there is a 2007 Russian miniseries adaptation. I have seen it and it is very good. It follows the novel's plot pretty closely. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paper bag which I transform into a hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A naturally tan hide I buy from a tannery in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First, I designed the cover, which what I did here, I found this modernist painting of the 19th century lower class urban tenement with a depiction of a few tenants, and I thought it nicely represented the dark and cold setting of the Crime and Punishment. So I adapted it to the cover. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So, if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.